Hello and welcome to the March edition of Mytech U, where today we're going to be talking about security patching and why set it and forget it doesn't work. So I'm pleased to have James Motes from our NOC team who will be leading the presentation. My name is Nathan Austin. I'll be doing some moderation and handling the panel of questions that might come in online. So a couple housekeeping components. Please use the question panel in your control panel, or the question tab in your control panel, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to interject them and get them answered online. If we're not able to, then we'll definitely take them offline with you directly and connect. So thank you for joining us. And again, today we're going to talk about security patching and some of the complicated components of it. And James is going to lead us through that as he's our NOC team lead here at Mytech. So I'll move on, James, and do you want to take it away?
Thanks, Nate. Appreciate getting the chance to talk about this. As somebody this is what I do on a daily basis. I'm up to my shoulders in patching and security. So again, a chance to kind of talk about it. Hopefully not get too technical. Nate will keep us on track for that. But we want to go over a couple things today. Mostly, why is this so important? It takes up an inordinate amount of time for us, and why is that? And why is the you as the business owner, or you as the person who's just using the computer in the business, why is this patching stuff always a problem? We'll kind of quickly go over what we mean by patching and what is it actually doing when we're saying all these terms. Give you some best practices, and then we're going to go into some ways that this process can and should impact the end user in sometimes negative, but mostly in a positive manner. So,
and James, before I just realized that before we move on to the first section here, I definitely wanted to identify, kind of who is the audience that we're trying to target and speak to here. And it's really kind of on multiple fronts. It's really, maybe someone who's responsible for their internal IT department, right? Some of the things that they should be aware of and some of the things I think they should expect, or reasons why we've seen through our experience, as well as potentially IT people themselves, right? So if they're the ones that are actually responsible for doing this stuff, there's a lot of assumptions out there in the industry that we've found that you shouldn't assume because that leaves you vulnerable. So, so we're going to speak some things in that regard, as well as we're going to speak to just kind of customers that might hire either Mytech for a support firm to help them with their IT, or any other IT support firm that might be out there, and the things that they should be looking for from their IT provider and what they could expect. So it's kind of a few different audiences. We're going to speak to different areas that will kind of touch on all those different fronts. So. Any other comments on that before we go to the next slide, James?
Yeah, go ahead. It just impacts everybody, and what we're talking about here should be kind of an overall approach to this that you want to, regardless of where you're coming from, you want to keep that in mind. So what happens when we don't have these updates? Like when this process isn't working, why is this important? Well, you might make the news. This has been a topic in the news a lot recently. In Minnesota here, where we're based, Target is got its headquarters here, and they're still reeling from over a year ago. Some of the problems they've been having. Home Depot had some of these problems. Sony Pictures made a lot of news recently. One that may or may not apply to you is a company called Primera Blue Cross. All of these that we're listing here are basically because the updating process failed. Somebody didn't have a patch applied when it was supposed to be applied, or where it was supposed to be applied, or not to enough of the places that needed it. In Target and Home Depot, that was as simple as the cash registers, where you're swiping your credit card before to pay for the goods that you bought. For Sony Pictures, there's a lot of theories right now, conspiracy theories even about how that was, but more or less everyone's pretty much believes that somebody got onto a system they shouldn't have, probably through an unpatched vulnerability. In Primera Blue Cross, that's 11 million user accounts. These numbers just start getting ridiculous. That personal identifiable information, if you're familiar with HIPAA, basically people's health records and social security numbers and all that are out in the wild now because it's probably an unpatched web server. One thing that's been a little bit quieter because it's hard to attribute it to somebody, but the largest bank heist in human history has just basically been confirmed. Over $1 billion taken by a bunch of thieves, probably out of Russia. basically by infiltrating a number of banks through their unpatched Microsoft Office products, so Word or Excel. They start there, they work their way through the system all the way up until they could just get to the ATM controls, so that when they walked past ATM machines, they would just spit out a bunch of money at the crook, and the guy would just keep going on his way. So bad things. You don't make the news for good things when security isn't applied. It's one of those things where there's no news about who's doing a good job at this. There's only really news about who's doing a bad job about this. So
yeah, and I would just add, you know, James, and I think this will kind of set you up for the next slide if I recall, is that, you know, none of these organizations are small because the news doesn't really care about the smaller organizations, right? If you're not a Target or a Home Depot or a Sony, you know, or you're talking in terms of millions or billions, you know, it usually isn't big enough to hit the news in this regard, but you know, it's still the same kind of technology that the small businesses, you know, deal
right.
with.
So, but yeah, that just to dovetail on that. So if I'm not a big name like that, I'm safe, right? Well, no. The way it works on the internet and how attacks happen on the internet is they just start by sweeping everywhere, and they don't care who you are. Most of these attacks, and so you're going to be lumped in there with the big people, and guess what? The big people spend a lot more on security than you ever will, but for the most part. So the small businesses, just in general, it's harder for them you can effectively protect yourself, but it's also not a priority in a lot of places. And so because it's an exposed segment of the population on the internet, it gets a lot of attention from the bad guys. And in fact, the economies of scale means they can try 500,000 different attack points of different small businesses, and they'll just keep trying until they find one. So the taller fence principle is here, both in the sense that, you know, if my fence is taller than my neighbor's, it's going to deter a crook from focusing on me. They're more likely to go to the guy with a short fence or unlocked door next door. In this case, we're talking about the corporations have really tall fences and walls. Now, they're not impregnable, as I've evidenced by that previous slide, but more than likely, it's going to take a lot more effort to get over that wall. So then they go down to, well, let's look at the small business walls, and are your quote-unquote walls of protection up higher than your neighbors? And small business cyber attacks, this is an important thing to remember. They don't make news headlines. CNN is not going to talk about one of Mytech's average customers being attacked by a cyber, you know, gang to steal their money. Those small businesses just go out of business. There are numerous examples I could give you, but you've never heard of them because they're companies of 10 to 50 people that had some sort of major cyber attack, usually involving somebody breaks into the network, gets on the accountant's PC, authorizes a money transfer into Russia, and there goes payroll. And that's it. You're basically going to close your doors at that point for the most part. Banks, you are not obligated to protect you at the same level they're obligated to protect just the consumer. So it's not going to make the news. It's just going to shut the doors more often than not, which is a sad fact of modern small business life.
And James, an interesting note when you say you know, getting onto the maybe the accounting person's PC and transferring funds. We actually had a peer that's in the IT industry that knows all about this kind of stuff, and their accounting person or someone who was filling in for them ended up using a PC that wasn't normally used for accounting, and actually that exact thing happened to them where funds were transferred. They were able to catch it pretty quickly because the bank caught it because it was a large amount. It was abnormal. But they actually did at least get to the point of actually transferring the dollars, but the bank stopped it. So that it can happen to anyone.
Yeah, this is the reality in which we're living and working with, and this is why it's important to us. It's not just a part of things that just makes IT feel good about themselves. This is keeping the business running at the core purpose of IT support. So what can you do about this? I mean, it can be scary, right? You hear the threats of getting your business shut down. Mytech we're in the business as an IT support specialist. We consider ourselves security generalists. We're not necessarily the people that you hear about that are tracking down the state actors in North Korea who may or may not be breaking into things over in the government here. We're trying to give you overall principles, help guide you in ways that you can get to a point where you have an effective layer of security appropriate to your size of your business. And one of the principles that almost always applies is to layer your security up. You don't ever want to rely on one component of protection for your network. So these are the basics. AV, antivirus, I mean, we can debate its effectiveness in a really technical way, but I mean, if you don't have it, you're just asking for trouble. When we say edge protection, we mean some sort of security device, a modern security device that can do advanced packet inspection, depacket inspection, and threat monitoring, something that sits between you and the bad denizens of the web. Email is really the most common way that bad things happen to companies, so you want some sort of filtering and protection in place at that level. When we say appropriate access, what we're talking about is not letting everybody in the company do whatever they want on your network. It seems, this is something we struggle with in small companies especially, that it seems like there's a trust thing. Well, they obviously don't trust me to log into this, the drive that has the accounting data. Well, it's not just trusting you, it's trusting whoever breaks into your account and where can they go. So, basically what we always try and do is we try and limit the administrative access, and we try and limit access to things like HR and accounting down to only those people who need it, just to minimize the threat, the amount of threats that can impact your business. And then finally, as we're talking about today, making sure the software is up to date. And we'll talk about updates and patching here in a minute. This is defense in depth, right? This is layering your security. This is making security at least some part of your corporate, how your company communicates with each other, making people aware that this is a potential problem. A lot of times it's, your last line of defense is going to be that person in accounting who gets a weird email that looks like it came from the boss saying, wire a bunch of money to this bank account. They better raise their hand in that case. If they're just, not thinking in a security mindset, they'll just blindly follow orders that come through the computer, you could see a lot of problems. Or they might click something they shouldn't, or not report somebody doing something suspicious on the network. We don't want to make a culture of fear, but we want people to understand the threats out there. So when we say defense in depth, we mean layering up your security, making your employees aware of it, revising these principles, addressing them, making sure you have a backup plan in place. There's a lot of things that your IT support person should be able to go over with you to maintain. And again, we're not talking about spending your entire operating budget on computer security, but you need to have appropriate controls and appropriate responses planned out before there's a problem, because if you wait until it becomes a problem, it's pretty much too late. So you need to really stay on top of this. What we often see is people that tend to set something up, and a year goes by, and another year goes by, and 3 years go by, and they've never really updated their kind of security plan or what's going on with it, and they just think it's all working because they haven't heard any problems. And that's just the general human mindset is, I haven't seen a problem recently, so it must be fine. And that is absolutely not the best way to approach this. You need some entity, whether it's yourself or an internal IT staff or an IT provider, somebody needs to be going through this on a regular basis to make sure it is actually working the way you expect it to. So let's talk a little bit about this updating patching process. And you can sound like a hip technical computer guy if you use the term patching instead of computer updates, because it's sort of, I think it goes back to the 90s probably, Nate, I don't know, where people would talk about patching up software. It means the same thing when, in this case, we're talking about fixing problems in existing software code after it's already been installed. This isn't like the developers making a new version of something. This is saying, the software is already in use, and oh, look, somebody found something wrong with it, and how we're going to fix that. The core of the problem here is that all software that everybody uses, and this is Linux, this is Mac, this is iOS, Android, whatever you want, any sort of computer language, they're full of bugs. This is because everything's written by a person. Human beings are prone to mistakes and errors, especially in complex things like computer code. And these errors are just, some of them are minor. Some of them just make you, when you click this button, the whole software crashes. And some of them are really major. Some of them mean if you do this certain set of things in a certain way, suddenly the computer grants you access into things it really shouldn't do. And some of them are so bad that even just browsing to a website allows an attacker to install malicious software and start trying to transfer money out of your bank account. So patches basically are things that change the code on machines that it's already installed. So we're trying to prevent bad guys from doing stuff. We're trying to fix things that are broken sometimes. Occasionally you'll see a patch that actually is just trying to add new features. Apple's famous for this. They kind of roll all these up into one kind of rollout update that's going to address all those at the same time. So like in your phone, if you went recently the latest iPhone, it's 8.02, I think, not only were there a lot of security bugs patched, which Apple kind of quietly did on the background without really announcing it, they were touting all the new features that you got because you're on this latest version of the operating system. Microsoft's approach is a little different. Microsoft tends to have new enhancements and new features separate from the security updates and broken features. They're all separately applied and installed. Just a little side there.
So James, a little comment on this. One of the things that I think frustrates, just especially non-technical, technology users, right? So basically, I'm talking about the general staff of companies we all work with, or customers of ours, is that the problem. One of the major problems with technology is the fact that we have to take something that, as this slide identifies it, right? It's fixing problems that are in software after it's already been installed and in use. So here is something that's in production. You've got the old cliche of, if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? But the problem with technology is, like, the things that are in production are actually broke, right? From a security perspective. And so it's finding the broken security pieces, which might not impact the functionality sometimes. So from an end user's perspective, they just see this as a problem, or they see it as a pain, as a frustration, because, hey, great, you just quote unquote fixed something, but it actually broke my functionality, right? So this is a very dynamic thing, and so making sure that it's communicating that this is a necessary thing and helping people understand, and that's part of our goal here, is that if we can help raise the education level of our customers and raise the education level of the industry in general, and trying to help communicate this message so that we can all be just more aware of that this is a necessary thing. And you know what? We're not Microsoft, and we're not Apple, and we can't control when some of the things that they do and the software that's released has problems. But yet, from a security perspective, it's our job and our obligation to fix it, or to at least apply these patches. So anyway, just wanted to kind of throw that commentary out there.
So we wanted to put this out there. This is a fairly standard list of what sorts of updates and things are we going to address when we're working with some of our managed customers. I would say this is fairly industry standard. Some places are a little bit different than this. Some might incorporate more or less of this, but in general, this is sort of what you're looking at. Primarily, what everyone's dealing with is Microsoft products. Now, that's because Microsoft, in the business world, at least up till now, and who knows for at least the immediate future, is still the predominant software that's in use everywhere, and therefore is one of the most attacked. Because if you can make a vulnerability in a Microsoft product, you instantly can get to, the majority of the world's computing population. So it makes sense for the bad guys to focus their efforts there. That's where most of the vulnerabilities show up. That's where most of the patches go. And when we talk about Microsoft, because Microsoft has so many different softwares, there's different components that we're looking at. When we talk about operating systems, we mean all flavors of Windows, the servers, the Surface Pros, the laptops, all the way up to the hypervisors. All the Windows operating systems have patches that need to be applied, and that's the most common kind of patching you're going to get. There are server applications that are going to be addressed by Mytech and by other providers because they're just core to delivering applications and IT services that businesses need to run. And then there's down to the client applications, so the things like Word or Excel or Outlook or Internet Explorer, which is the big culprit usually, on an endpoint machine. All of these things need to be addressed. Now, secondary to all of that, and actually this is the growing side of the problem of patching, is the third-party software. So things like Adobe Reader, Java, like browsers like Firefox or Chrome, all of these programs are fairly common. My guess is you've heard of at least one of those things on this list, even if you don't use it yourself. They're installed on a number of machines, almost as many machines as like Office products, Microsoft Office products, and they have bugs too, and they need to be patched and taken care of. Adobe and Java in particular have a pretty bad rap in the IT world for having some pretty nasty vulnerabilities that they weren't always timely about repairing. They've been getting better in the last couple of months, even the last year or so. But overall, these things we can't just do some of the patching and then ignore this side. The problem is that the third-party software tends to have a less refined delivery system. Microsoft is actually a very robust patching delivery process that everybody understands. It may not always work, but everyone understands how it's supposed to work. The problem with the third-party software, as we call it, is that every vendor patches them a little bit differently, and they interact with other applications in unexpected ways. And so it tends to be a little more cautious entry into this realm where we're needing to work more closely hand in hand with a customer in order to make this work in an effective way. In a lot of cases, you may not even need some of this stuff, so we'll just take it off so it's not sitting there as a vulnerability on your network. Other times you do need it, but you can only get it updated to a certain point until another vendor software that you use updates past their point, and there's a back and forth thing. It takes a lot of communication to work out what's legitimate in there and what's not. But this is kind of in a nutshell. When we're talking about patching, these are the sorts of things you want to make sure are getting addressed somehow on your network.
And James, before we go to the next slide, just some commentary on that. Where we've seen this impact our customers the most, as James, you mentioned, is in if there are browser-based applications, right, where a vendor will write a program that's accessed via, say, Internet Explorer, but yet your Internet Explorer version can't exceed a certain level, otherwise it breaks the application. So here we're that's a kind of an anomaly or an exception. So we need to make sure, A, we communicate around that, but otherwise we can't update past a certain point, otherwise it'll break things. And so that's kind of a key thing around making sure that that's communication you have with your IT support provider or someone like Mytech or your internal IT department. The other thing that is, and I appreciate, James, you're really calling out the secondary piece here, but even though that's the secondary kind of component of patching, that seems to be more the primary target of threat vectors today. And that is oftentimes the piece that, especially if you have internal IT staff and they're responsible for patching, they're probably not doing that well. I'm not trying to call out their competency. It's just that that's an area that's oftentimes overlooked, in part because of what James expressed, which is it's not a robust delivery mechanism, and each vendor has their own method of doing it, and so it's really time-consuming to stay on top of that piece. So that's something we always like to call out to make sure that you're doing those things if it applies to your world and if you have those programs on your environment or in your environment.
So I just want to highlight quickly a couple of things that would not show up in a normal patching procedure for Mytech. We always follow the decimal point rule. So whether automatically or on demand, if a customer would ask us for assistance in updating something, we're just kind of going to include it if it's going from like 10.1 to 10.2. So to the right of the decimal point, that's usually a feature, a security, it's a minor tweak to an existing code base. It's not a big deal. Usually it's not a problem it doesn't usually cause as many problems to upgrade to that. So that's something that Mytech tends to help handle. However, the major ones to the left of the decimal point, where we're going from like version 10 to version 11, those tend to include a lot of new features, a lot of new functions, a lot of new code. Those we don't tend to just kind of lump in with our normal day-to-day support activities. We tend to try and really bring, because it takes more effort to deliver that effectively, and we want to coordinate that and plan for that and test that a little bit more robustly than we would on a normal small release update. We tend to try and call that out separately to the customer and handle that in a different manner. A lot of places right now we're still developing. There isn't really in the industry, I would say there's a couple solutions. We haven't found one that we like enough to say that we're going to do mobile device management. You might hear that as MDM. That's taking things like company phones or company iPads or Android tablets or whatever and controlling them from a central location. So if they get lost or they need new configurations applied instead of touching each one of them, you can do them centrally. We don't really do that at this point. That's something, again, we're working on developing, and when the industry provides us with a tool we like, we'll be going farther down that road. Some other things are some common vendor, other vendor softwares like VMware. That's a very common virtualization infrastructure software. We, Exchange, SharePoint, Microsoft CRM. Some of these, it's not to say that we won't ever do that, but what we're going to be doing is we're going to do that on demand. If we evaluate those on sort of a separate basis, rarely are they giving you security feature updates. And a lot of times, even if they are, because of the nature of those applications, they're a little bit more controlled access, so it's not usually as problematic from a threat to your network. So they also tend to break things rather substantially if they go wrong, much more than an Outlook update might. So we only apply those in controlled, on-demand circumstances. So just wanted to bring that up as something that Mytech at least has decided on. And each IT support provider is going to come up with their own rules and methods and ways that they can effectively deliver patch management to whether it's their own company or other departments or to all their customers. They should be able to articulate that to you. So you always want to make sure you're aware of that, so you're not expecting something that they're not actually going to be doing on an automatic basis. So.
Yeah, thanks. And James, on the mobile device side, I definitely, I remember you telling our team, in particular, that there's been a lot more vulnerabilities out there that are attacking Android devices. But even I know that you mentioned the iOS updates recently. You were pretty strongly recommended our team if they had, if they had iPhones, to make sure that they're updating to the latest versions. So I mean, those are we definitely say we don't patch it automatically because right now the tool set that exists in the industry it's a pretty smartphones from the standpoint of having like an iOS or an Android didn't really exist until when the iPhone was announced in 2007. BlackBerry had their BlackBerry Enterprise software, but again, not many people are using BlackBerries anymore. So this is an emerging kind of developing, maturing space. And as James said, it's even though we don't have the tools where we feel we can do that and roll that out effectively as if we can for your servers and workstations and laptops, it's still an important piece that we recommend. Having some reminders, educate your users, educate your staff, so that they are keeping their phones up to date, especially if you're allowing them to, which most of them probably are, having corporate email and things like that on them.
Right. We did want to bring up some interesting points about what else aren't we patching, even if they are within what would normally fall, like Microsoft products, specifically unsupported operating systems. This has always been a point of contention because, let's face it, this stuff is expensive, and you hate to hear somebody arbitrarily tell you that what you've got that seems to be working just fine needs to be replaced. So Windows XP that one's been in the news a lot. I hopefully don't need to talk too much about that. The extended support, when we say extended support, that means Microsoft not doing anything new as far as features, but still releasing security updates. That ended completely for XP in 2014, and April something, I want to say April 30th maybe. What that means is even if somebody discovered a major vulnerability to instantly control all XP machines in the world, Microsoft is going to shrug their shoulders and say, sorry, you should be on something else anyway. We're not going to fix it. What's interesting is if you look the next line, Windows 7 technically ended support in 2013. Now, when I say that, I don't mean the Windows 7 that most of us are probably using right now. I mean the Windows 7 that doesn't have Service Pack 1 applied. This is very important. Microsoft makes the distinction that says if you're Windows 7, period, versus Windows 7 Service Pack 1 or SP1, Windows 7 by itself is not supported. Only Windows 7 Service Pack 1 is supported. So this is, again, a time when the IT support people need to be on top of what service packs are applied, even if the base operating system is a current supportable version. It may not matter if the right service pack isn't there. Again, Windows 8, same thing. This actually hit the news. Microsoft kind of did a weird thing with this where they put Windows 8 and then 8.1, and then technically the only supported version is Windows 8.1 Update 1, which again is like a service pack that brings that operating system into complete compliance. If you don't have Windows 8.1 Update 1, you are on an unsupported operating system that is not getting security patches. So any vulnerabilities that are discovered, again, not Microsoft's problem. They're not going to fix them. Even if you have automatic updates rolling on these machines, if they aren't on the correct service pack, they will not pick up any new updates, and your network is vulnerable. And I did want to highlight that this is about to happen in Server 2003 this year. I believe it's in June, Nate. That's
mid-July. Mid-July, from what I understand, yeah.
Think June, so you're ready for it. That's what we're going to go with. Actually, I did want to highlight the note at the bottom. All versions, even Service Pack 1 of Windows 7, are really only on extended support right now. They're in their sunset period. They're not going to get any new features. They're only going to get security updates for the next couple of years. Microsoft's basically saying, don't buy any more of these. Start buying Windows 8 or Windows 10 when that comes out. So it's worth noting that what just happened with XP last year, that process has already begun for Windows 7 as of this year. So.
And James, I did get a question from the audience that I neglected to catch before we went on to this slide, but it was really around, we said what we don't automatically patch is SQL, but then there's a question that came from the audience that says, do you automatically apply SQL service packs? And I think the answer to that is no, but can you elaborate on that a little bit?
No, if there's a SQL security vulnerability, like that could go out, but the service packs typically on demand. That's when we look at it. If there's a problem that needs to be fixed, or if we evaluate and say, you know what, until the service pack is on there, there's going to be a security vulnerability that needs to be covered, that's when we're going to do it. It tends not to be an automated process. There's just so many things that can go wrong. We would much rather have that kind of be what we call an attended install. Most of our update processes are automatic. They happen after hours so our users don't get interrupted too badly. That's one we'd probably do while a tech is attending it and schedule it with the customer to coordinate the downtime, make sure it's a backup, go through that process. All of those big applications that Exchange, CRM, that's the boat we're in with a lot of those. Is we will do that on demand just to prevent any major outages and we're kind of keeping track of those separately from the standard rank and file updates that we're releasing. Hope that helps.
Thanks, James.
So regardless of who's doing your updates, like in a nutshell, this is what you want to look for in a patching process. You don't want to just, you want this to be a thought-out, controlled, somebody's taking every one of these steps, starting with building the list of updates that you're going to approve to deploy on your network. We'll get into a second why you don't just want to check the box that says Windows do this automatically. That's more or less okay for home users. That's really not okay for a business. So you want to actually put some thought into what's rolling out. Then you want to figure out, okay, now I've got this list of what I want to be installed. What is actually installed? This is a very difficult thing to do. You can do this pretty simply on one machine by going to the control panel and looking at installed updates. But if you're trying to do this for 10, 30, 100, 200 endpoints, it becomes quite difficult. And so you have to know what's there so you know what to install. Then you have to figure out when you're going to get the actual bits of data from Microsoft or the other software vendors, pull them down through the internet, and then get them ready to install, which doesn't seem like that'd be that big of a deal until we're talking again on the scale of like 50 to 100 endpoints that are all pulling 20 to 30 megs of data each. That adds up in a hurry. Most companies don't have an internet connection that's going to be big enough to have that happen all at once for every machine at the same time. And so then they all start waiting on each other, and they might get an update applied, but then they might not. And if you only have one update window for the week or for the month, then you might run into trouble with getting, they'll take months to get caught up instead of days. So again, that needs to have some thought put into it. You need to actually figure out how to get the updates to install once they've been downloaded to the appropriate machine. That often works, but can occasionally have trouble. And then you want to, a lot of times after you do this, because it's changing the code on an installed piece of software, it won't take effect until the machine reboots. And everybody hates rebooting their machine, whether it's a server or an endpoint. You have to be able to get that done and executed to get that downloaded and installed update applied. So all 5 steps need to have some thought applied to them. They need to have somebody who's walking through it, making sure every stage of that is executing the way you expect it to. So that's sort of the core of, even if it's an internal person doing it or a company or you're just doing it yourself, these are kind of the general best practices across the industry that you need to have in place. before you're going to have an effective patching solution.
And James, as we go to the next slide, and I don't want to take much, but I know that sounded, maybe to a lot of the audience like, well, okay, sure, that sounds really simple. But as James pointed out, each one of those steps has things that can go wrong. And if you're just, again, like the title of this whole presentation is why set it and forget it doesn't work, is because if any one of those stages fails and you don't know that it fails, and if you're not watching if it fails and to manage it, then you're not executing on the security patching that you need to be doing to keep your organization whole. So
most of the time, if they don't work, they're going to not work. They don't tell you that they didn't work. Usually, it's a silent fail on most of those. So, yeah. Just run to go over real quick. Mytech Default. Now, this is adjustable, but sort of a way that we've approached this as a best practice, and your provider should be able to articulate this as well. We kind of divide them in two segments. There's the workstations that kind of need the updates more. They're kind of the most vulnerable usually. They need things a little more frequently. We go through once a month, typically after Microsoft releases a batch of updates or other vendors do, evaluate if there's problems, evaluate what's the critical one. Typically, at the end of the month, we're going to release a bunch to deploy whatever the next window is, which normally we're going to detect for what's installed twice a day, pull it down daily, cache it. Actually, we should have put that on there. We cache these updates on the network. We will install and reboot on a daily basis for most workstations and laptops. Again, by default. We can always adjust with a user or customer if we need to. Whereas servers, because they need to be stable and there's limited access, or should be, we can usually be a little bit, we can go, instead of daily, we tend to kind of focus on a weekly. So again, we approve updates at the end of the month. We'll check what's installed twice a day just to make sure we know what's there. We'll download, install, and reboot on a weekly schedule, again, by default. And we can go faster than this as well. You might hear about an occasional zero-day update. That just means somebody has found a really bad exploit, something that is really a problem and it's going to be bad news. Sometimes they get fancy names like Heartbleed or Freak or any of the other crazy ones that have come out recently. Those need immediate action. We might skip ahead a little bit in the process to get those installed. Always with communication with our customers and users, but this is the sort of thing that might need to be dealt with faster than normal, and then really audited to make sure it's in place, because it typically means not only is there a bad thing that could happen, people have discovered that bad guys are actively doing that bad thing, and you need to take care of it ASAP. So we wanted to highlight what you should be expecting here. What expectations should you have, whether it's Mytech or an internal person or you're doing it yourself? You should expect some impact. Again, if this isn't a visible process, if you don't see anything happening, you should be questioning whether or not it's actually doing what you want. Now, we want minimal disruptions. We want this on a controlled, coordinated, well-communicated plan, but you should be seeing some impacts. You should see regular updates going out. Machines should get rebooted. They should have patches being applied. They should have, changes to the systems will happen over time while your patching provider is applying these updates. Now, there's a balance here. There's a convenience factor. Security is just annoying. That's like the first rule of security. It's just going to annoy people. You have to put a balance together of whether or not that annoyance is worth the security, covering up the security risk. And that's up to each provider to work out with each customer. But you should absolutely expect a little bit more inconvenience than if there was no patching being done at all. And again, we should expect a managed deployment. We should expect some thought being put into this process. Just clicking a box and walking away from it is not going to get it done over the long term. You don't want to just assume that things are just working and then 6 months later realize after the breach that something had broken along the way. So you really want some accountability into this process. Whether this is you as the CFO who's overseeing the IT department or somebody who is contracting a vendor to come in and take care of this, they should be auditing your patch compliance levels regularly. You should be able to ask for reports indicating how compliant you are. You should be able to get kind of a second opinion to kind of sweep through and say, how are we doing? You don't want to be surprised by this. And again, if it's If not, you don't see any impacts, if you don't see anything going sideways on this, every once in a while, you might want to start questioning whether or not anything's actually being done. So it is it's one of these things that you don't, it's going to take some effort. So you want to make sure that you're watching out for it. And really, the biggest problems that we've seen as we've come in and like taken over from somebody, or when we've kind of caught ourselves, it's been somebody wasn't looking, wasn't paying enough attention. Now, this does impact the user. They're going to see something. Their computer is going to get rebooted, and say nobody really likes when that happens, because a lot of times everybody does this. They've been writing the proposal, or they've been writing that email for the last hour, and then they go to lunch or they go home for the day and they come back and it's gone, and then they're mad. Well, unsaved work is just, it could get lost if it reboots in the middle of the night. If you're running an overnight job, this happens on occasion. Accounting firms or manufacturing firms might queue up a job to run overnight, and if they aren't communicating that with their IT support team, that gets interrupted. Again, more grief and frustration. So what really needs to happen is there needs to be some education going on with the staff. Again, why is this important to us? We don't want to close our doors because of a security breach. The easiest thing to do is to log off and or save your work. By telling people to log off, that's effectively making that happen. But even if they just lock their machine and go home, if they've got everything saved up, that should minimize any impact. And again, if there's exceptions that need to happen, I'm going to be working late, I need a job to run overnight, I really can't afford to have this, any interruptions to this machine, your IT support team needs to be able to humanize the exception. They need to be able to communicate with the users, work out a solution that can allow your business to function the way it needs to function while still taking care of the security needs.
Yeah, James, that was one of the things that I wanted. I think that's going to, this next slide will bring it up as far as how we found out that there was a major problem in Microsoft's agent, and I guess this is a little bit to tell you some of these things that'll fit into this slide. I forgot we weren't going to cover on the last one, so go ahead.
So sometimes we deal with customers, especially when Mytech or whoever the IT provider hasn't done a very good job educating the users about this process. They're going to say, well, I have all these updates that aren't installed. What's going on here? I thought you were taking care of this. Mytech built in an intentional lag period between when Microsoft releases an update or another vendor releases an update and when we install it. This is because Microsoft just isn't capable, for as big and as much money as they have, they are not capable of knowing the exact way that your computer is set up, interacts with other computers, and how you use it. Therefore, they test, but they don't test specifically for you. So often what happens is almost every month, something slips by the testers and major problems develop. Right now, there's a news going around right now. If you search for the KB that I put there, KB3033929, if you put that into Google, you'll probably get a bunch of results about, it's breaking everything, it just makes my computer reboot, I don't know what I'm doing. There's a lot of problems with that. My mother-in-law right now, as a matter of fact, and when I go home, I'm going to be working with her to try and fix that, because the automatic deployment of that update basically broke something in the operating system for the machines for a lot of these users, and it just gets stuck in a boot loop until somebody can get in there, break the cycle, uninstall the update, apply whatever fix, and then redo it. There are also times when the patches just don't install right. Again, for as robust as Microsoft is, or the other vendors can be for deploying updates, a lot of times something in those 5 steps just doesn't work. It doesn't reboot, it doesn't install correctly, it doesn't, it might try and download and fail and then forget that it needs to finish downloading later. There's a lot of ways that this process goes sideways. One of the things that Nate was bringing up is that the Windows component, the little piece of software that lives inside of every Windows operating system that says, take care of these updates for me, that actually needs to be updated itself. And that Windows Update Agent update, which is inconveniently named, was sort of rolled out, but not really. And if it didn't install correctly, you wouldn't even realize that you were missing updates. So again, if you have a list of updates that you know are supposed to be installed, and you can detect that they are not installed, then you can start figuring out, well, what's causing that problem? Oh, look, the piece of software that's supposed to be controlling this silently didn't update itself, and now it doesn't even know that new updates exist. There's just so many ways for this to go wrong. But basically, the biggest reason that there's always updates missing, I think there's 47 on the average machine right now that were released by Microsoft this month that Mytech has not yet approved for deployment, and that's because we just don't trust that they're not going to break everything yet. We're giving some testing time internally. We run them through some trial systems. We want to make sure that the reports that we're getting are in line with what we're willing to accept as a risk before we just release them out to the end user machine. Again, it's a thought out, intentional process, not a just check the box and walk away.
James, so one question that came in. I know we've got just a couple more minutes here, folks. So I know that we like to promptly end at noon, and we're already like a minute over. But give us a few more minutes if you can hang on, because there's some good content here, and a great question was asked online, which is about how do you work out a desktop reboot schedule. And in particular, I think this is one that organizations think about is, do you make sure users keep computers on all the time, or are there power management things that we do to turn machines back on, or how do we handle that that interaction? And I know that, James, this is a struggle that we have as far as managing that across thousands of endpoints, but
yeah.
Maybe you can elaborate on some of those variables.
I'm trying to think how to wrap this up in short answers. I guess it depends is the way I'd start. Often we love when people just leave them on all the time, and then things just tend to work. But that's not a realistic thing, and so we understand that, and we want to work with each customer and each set of users within that customer separately to figure out what's the best way to make it happen. A lot of times what we'll do is we'll just actually set the installed window during the day and prompt the user to say, hey, can we reboot now, or can we wait a little bit? Or we might just push with the install without the reboot time, and then prompt the user to reboot at the end of the day. Or there are a number of things that we can do, power management, things like sending the quote-unquote magic packet to wake the machine back up, calling a user up, sending it during the day silently and telling them to reboot later. There's a lot of approaches we can take. No one thing works for everybody, and so we have to be responsive to those customer needs, I guess is the way I'd want to do it. And if we need to be more involved and hands-on, then we will absolutely be more involved and hands-on, because this is an important component of the services that we deliver.
And it's easier to deal with, so to speak, it's easier to deal with desktops than laptops. And laptops definitely throw, and I know that we had a problem with my laptop at one point, for example, because my laptop was lid closed in my laptop bag at my house, and and it was trying to apply some patches and things like so. It was trying to get at that, get at the machine. So trying to do things like technology called wake on LAN, or so that the machine could be off, but the power management allows us to wake it back up, to apply patches, and then shut it back down. So that is an evolving technology. Some of it exists today if you've invested in Intel vPro, which usually adds a couple $100 each one of the PCs you ever buy. But there's other technology we can use built into Windows power management that I know is an evolving thing. But I think James put it really well, which is not any one methodology is going to apply to everybody. So it's a matter of understanding the unique environment and trying to get as much standardized as possible so we can get whatever your organization is doing in the same window. But then it's dealing with the exceptions. But again, that's the whole point of this whole process needs to be managed because there's always going to be exceptions.
Right. That's the right segue into this. We want to end with saying that this requires constant vigilance. This should be a lot of work. If you're doing this and you don't feel like it's a lot of work, I'm going to say that I think you're doing it wrong. You need to be tracking those assets. You've got to be paying attention to what's coming out. You've got to check that what you think is happening is actually happening. Again, if things aren't rebooting or not being turned on at night, this user might have disabled their Windows update on their own because they didn't want to get annoyed by it, and they didn't tell you, and you're not going to know, and that's a vulnerability on your network. You've got to be able to check, to figure out, you have somebody else check. You've got to be able to work through this list. What we see is that it's so easy to forget about. This is constantly a thing that everyone knows is important who works in the industry, but it's also not really urgent, except in rare circumstances. We talk about the 0 days. It's usually an important thing that I got to get to at some point, but if the CEO is telling me that his email doesn't work, guess what's going to take priority over that? So it tends to always be at the bottom of the average IT person's to-do list. And that's no slam on an average IT person. I will say that most IT people are probably overworked, but this is always going to be the thing that's pushed out to later because there's so many steps that requires so much work. It requires specialized tools to do it effectively if you're going more than, I would say, 10 machines. And most places just don't have the resources or the time and training to get those tools configured and running and monitored. And even with the tool sets, you can't just leave it alone. There's so many exceptions that will always come up that you've got to have somebody who's got eyes on it all the time. And so, again, if you do have an IT person who's doing this, it's worth digging in a little bit, poking at them a little bit. It's worth asking them how much time they're spending on it every month. 30 minutes, that would be an answer that would concern me. And maybe they're just that good, then you should probably give them a raise. But I would say most of the time that if that's all that they're doing, there's probably something they're missing. So it's just something that really is just going to take, whether it's a provider or an internal staff, if it's you yourself, you should expect this to take up some time to do it right.
Yeah, so thank you, James. Just going to the last slide, saying thanks to everyone for participating. This is, and by the way, we just covered security patching. We didn't even get into, a lot of the same stuff applies to antivirus. A lot of the same stuff applies to firewalls and email filtering. There's a lot of this same kind of being on top of this and not being able to just set it and forget it methodology that applies to really anything around security in your organization, which is why and we feel this constant vigilance needs to be not only, especially at the security level, some tool set that you're using, because the tool will be able to do these things better than a person can, but a person or persons needs to be overseeing this and needs to have some oversight and double checking, because the tools will break, whether it's the tool itself or something on an individual endpoint like a server or workstation or a laptop, and as well as having some oversight from a leadership perspective, whether it be a CIO, CFO, CEO, IT director, whatever, poking and making sure that there's some accountability to these processes. So, so thanks a lot for watching. James, any final comments?
It's hard work, but it's necessary. So please make sure it's happening. And whether that's with Mytech doing it or somebody else, we are always looking to improve how we do it because it's so complicated. But it's definitely something that it needs attention on your network. And if you don't think you're getting it, it's time to reach out to somebody who can provide that for you.
Thank you, James, and thank you, everybody. This recording will be available online in about 24 hours if you ever want to refer it to anybody else. But thank you all for your time, and have a great day.